When the world learned that Ace Frehley, the original lead guitarist of Kiss, had passed away, the news rippled through the rock community like a thunderclap. For millions who grew up watching him ignite arenas with his otherworldly solos and cosmic persona, the idea that Space Ace was gone felt almost impossible to accept. His guitar had always seemed immortal, a weapon of light and fire that defined a generation of sound. Yet now, silence filled the space where his electrifying riffs once roared. Tributes poured in from fans across continents, candles burned outside old concert venues, and radio stations replayed Kiss classics in a continuous loop. But it wasn't until the funeral, that unforgettable, almost unreal day, that the world truly realized what it had lost. The service took place in Morristown, New Jersey, a small town with a history intertwined with Ace's music career. The chapel was modest, but the atmosphere inside was monumental. Dim light reflected off rows of guitars placed along the walls, instruments Ace himself had collected, played, and cherished through decades of chaotic brilliance. His casket rested near the stage, draped with a simple black cloth and a silver lightning bolt embroidered across it, symbolizing the spark that had electrified rock for over half a century. The attendees were a mixture of family, lifelong fans, and some of the biggest names in music. But the air was thick not with fame, but with reverence. It had been only a few weeks since the tragedy at Morristown Studios. Ace had been deep into recording sessions for what was meant to be his most personal solo album yet, a project he once described as a return to the roots, but with the energy of my 20s. That energy, though, may have been what pushed his body too far. Studio engineers revealed that he had been recording for hours without rest, standing close to his amplifier, adjusting every note and effect himself. Sometime in the late evening, he lost his balance and fell, striking his head. At first, it seemed minor, just another clumsy moment from a man known for pushing limits. But hours later, his condition worsened. Doctors confirmed internal bleeding, a traumatic brain injury. He was rushed into emergency surgery, but the complications proved devastating. By the early hours of October 16, 2025, the monitor beside his hospital bed went still. He was 74 years old. The bandmates who had once shared the stage with him, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss, released statements within hours of the confirmation. Gene called him a warrior of sound, while Paul described him as the pulse that turned chaos into spectacle. Peter Criss, the Catman, kept silent. For days he said nothing. Reporters speculated that grief had silenced him, that their history, turbulent, fiery, and deeply human, had left too many wounds to reopen. But what no one knew was that Peter was preparing something the world would never forget. The morning of the funeral dawned gray, almost cinematic in its sorrow. Rain brushed lightly against the stained glass windows of the chapel as the service began. Soft organ music played a slow rendition of Beth, the song Peter had once sung with Kiss, a haunting, ironic echo of another time. Then came the eulogies. Family, close friends, producers, and fellow musicians spoke about Ace's genius and stubborn independence. One producer recounted how Ace could spend entire nights trying to perfect a single riff, refusing to leave the studio until it felt like lightning. Another recalled his laugh, loud, childlike, unfiltered, the kind that could shake the tension out of any room. But it was midway through the ceremony that something shifted. As the murmurs faded, a familiar figure rose from the second row, Peter Criss himself. The audience held its breath. Dressed entirely in black, his hair silvered with age, Peter walked slowly to the podium. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable. For decades, the relationship between Ace and Peter had been a mystery. Sometimes close brothers in arms, sometimes estranged bandmates divided by fame, addiction, and time. What he was about to say would remind everyone that no feud could erase the kind of bond forged on stage under blinding lights. Peter began not with words, but with sound. From behind the podium, he pressed a small button on a recording device he had brought. A low hum filled the chapel, followed by the unmistakable whine of an old guitar amp warming up. The audience leaned forward. What followed was a short, raw recording, just Ace alone playing an unfinished piece. It was stripped of production, no backing band, no studio polish. The melody was mournful, almost hesitant, like a man whispering his thoughts through strings. And then Peter spoke, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "That's how I want you to remember him," he said. "Not the makeup, not the fireworks, but that sound. That sound was Ace." He paused, looking over at the casket. "We were brothers once," he continued. "We fought, we laughed, we fell apart, but we always found our way back through the music. I've played with a lot of drummers, singers, and guitarists in my life, but no one could make a guitar talk like Ace Frehley." His words carried the kind of sincerity that silences an entire room. Even Gene, sitting quietly near the front, lowered his head. Peter went on to share a story few had ever heard. It was 1975, the peak of Kiss's chaotic fame. The band had just finished a show in Detroit, drenched in sweat and exhaustion. Backstage, Ace sat alone, staring at his guitar like it was both his greatest love and his biggest burden. Peter walked over and said, "Man, you killed it out there." Ace looked up, smiled faintly, and replied, "Yeah, but one day, it's gonna kill me back." The room gasped softly as Peter repeated that line. He said it like a joke, Peter recalled, but there was truth in it. Music was his life, and it took everything from him, but it also gave everything to us. For the next few minutes, Peter spoke not as a bandmate, but as an old friend. He talked about the nights they spent after shows, driving aimlessly through New York, laughing, drinking, and dreaming about what their music could become. He remembered Ace's strange humor, how he would crack jokes seconds before stepping on stage, how he could turn any rehearsal into chaos and brilliance at the same time. "Ace was the spark," Peter said softly. "Without him, there wouldn't have been fireworks." Then, without warning, Peter reached beneath the podium and pulled out a small acoustic guitar. The crowd murmured. No one expected what came next. He strummed a slow, fragile melody. The chapel fell into silence, save for the creak of strings and the quiet rhythm of rain outside. "This," Peter said, "is something we started years ago but never finished." His fingers trembled slightly as he played. The tune was simple, emotional, and hauntingly beautiful. Midway through, his voice joined in, rough but honest, singing just one line he had written for this moment. "Brother, keep the stars alive." The performance lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt eternal. By the time he stopped, many in the audience, grown men, industry veterans, even reporters, were visibly moved. There were no cameras clicking, no one daring to interrupt. It was the kind of tribute that transcended fame and ego. It was pure. Afterward, Peter placed the guitar beside Ace's casket and stepped back. "I think he'd like that," he whispered. "He never wanted a big show, just music." He looked up briefly as if acknowledging something unseen. "Rest easy, Space Ace." Then he returned to his seat in silence. Outside, as the service ended, the sky began to clear. The storm that had hung over the chapel all morning slowly drifted away, revealing a sliver of sunlight. It was as though the world itself was letting out a long, quiet sigh. Reporters later described the moment as otherworldly, but those who were there said it was something even deeper. It was closure. As guests slowly began to leave the chapel, thinking the service had ended, a quiet commotion began near the front. A woman, unfamiliar to most in attendance, stepped forward. She wasn't part of the rock world, not a musician, not an industry name anyone recognized. Yet she carried herself with calm certainty, her expression both broken and brave. Those closest to Ace's family seemed to know her, but to everyone else, she was a mystery. The crowd settled back into their seats as she took her place at the podium. What she said next would change everything people thought they knew about Ace Frehley. Her voice was gentle but steady. "My name doesn't matter," she began. "What matters is that Ace once told me, if he ever left this world before he was ready, I should make sure people hear what he never had the courage to release." The room grew silent again. Even Peter, still seated with his head bowed, looked up in surprise. She took a small device from her bag, an old portable recorder, and set it down. "This," she said softly, "was Ace's final recording. He made it just days before the accident. He told me to play it when the time felt right." A faint static filled the speakers, followed by the unmistakable sound of Ace's voice. "Not singing, but speaking. If you're hearing this," the recording began, "I guess the amps are quiet now. I've lived my life loud. Too loud, maybe. But that's the only way I knew how to live." His tone was reflective, calm, almost philosophical. "They say you can't chase starlight, but I spent my whole life trying. Maybe I caught a little of it." A few people gasped quietly. Hearing his voice so raw, so human, felt almost unbearable. Then came the music, a slow acoustic ballad that no one had ever heard before. The melody carried the warmth of nostalgia, the simplicity of a man who'd seen everything and still found beauty in imperfection. There were no effects, no layered production, just Ace's voice, aged but full of soul, and the faint buzz of his guitar strings. The final words of the song were haunting. "Don't let the stars fade out. Play on when I can't." And then, silence. The room was still. Even the sound technicians hesitated to move. The woman wiped a tear from her cheek before continuing. "Ace recorded that alone," she said. "No producers, no label. Just him and an old analog tape deck in a small studio outside Los Angeles. He said it was his way of saying goodbye, not to the fans, but to me." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Who was she? What connection did she have with him that no one else knew about? She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke again. "We met in the late 70s, she explained. "He had just left Kiss. I was an actress stepping away from Hollywood. We were both tired, of noise, of expectations, of pretending. We found peace in quiet studios, in long nights filled with music and no cameras. We loved in silence because the world would never have understood it." Her words carried a weight that no one dared to question. The revelation stunned everyone present. For decades, fans had speculated about Ace's love life, but no one had ever imagined a secret relationship lasting years, hidden from tabloids and interviews alike. There had never been photos, mentions, or clues. Yet as she spoke, it became clear this was no fantasy. Several people from the old music scene nodded, remembering whispers of Ace spending months working in private studios on mysterious tapes no one ever heard. She described how Ace, in his later years, often spoke about feeling forgotten, not by his fans, but by the industry. He didn't care about fame anymore, she said. He cared about truth, about music that meant something. She paused, looking toward the casket. "He once told me that if people could hear his music without the makeup, without the fire, they'd finally see the real man behind Space Ace. That's the man I knew." As her story unfolded, Criss quietly rose and joined her near the front. There was no script, no rehearsal, just a shared silence between two people who had both loved the same man in different ways. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something only she could hear. Then he faced the crowd once more. "You all heard his last song," Peter said, his voice hoarse. "You know, Ace always said the guitar was his voice. But what you just heard, that was his heart." From that moment, the ceremony became more than a farewell. It transformed into a kind of revelation, a window into the soul of a man who had spent his life behind amplifiers and stardust, now finally stripped bare. Fans who had idolized the image of Space Ace were now meeting the person he truly was: vulnerable, introspective, human. After the recording ended, the chapel's speakers faded into quiet and a single spotlight illuminated the stage. The woman approached Ace's casket one last time and placed a small envelope on top. "He wrote this years ago," she said softly. "It's a letter he told me to keep until this day. It simply says, 'When the music stops, let love play on.'" The guests were overcome with emotion. Some wept openly. Others just sat frozen, unsure of what to feel. Gene Simmons, known for his iron composure, was seen quietly wiping his eyes. Paul Stanley later described the moment as the most human I'd ever seen Ace, even after he was gone. In the days that followed, stories of the funeral spread like wildfire across social media. The press called it the most emotional farewell in rock history. But beyond the headlines and tributes, there was a deeper story that only those who attended could truly understand. The woman's identity was never publicly revealed. Neither she nor Peter ever spoke again about what happened inside that chapel. The recording, Ace's final song, was never released commercially. According to his daughter Monique, it remains safely stored in a private archive, just as her father wanted. In the weeks after the funeral, Ace's home studio in New York was carefully cataloged. Technicians found notebooks filled with lyrics, unreleased demos, and handwritten notes detailing his plans for the next album. Some of these songs, according to insiders, captured the nostalgic energy of his Frehleys Comet era, powerful, raw, and unfiltered. But hidden among the tapes was one titled "Starlight Keeps Me Alive." Written in his own handwriting, it bore a dedication for those who stayed when the lights went out. It became clear that even in his final days, Ace was aware that his time was limited. Despite declining health and years of physical strain, he refused to stop creating. His doctor later shared that Ace's resilience bordered on obsession. He lived for sound, the doctor said. He would come home exhausted, barely able to stand, and still spend hours tinkering with his guitar tones. It wasn't work to him. It was breathing. The legacy Ace left behind went far beyond platinum records or legendary concerts. He embodied the restless spirit of rock, flawed, fearless, and endlessly searching for meaning in noise. For Peter Criss, that funeral performance wasn't a goodbye. It was a final duet between two men who had lived their dreams together and paid the price for them. "We didn't say goodbye," Peter later told a close friend. "We just changed stages." Months after the funeral, fans began gathering outside old Kiss landmarks, the loft where the band first rehearsed, the arenas they once ruled, and even the Morristown studio where Ace recorded his final notes. Someone left a small speaker playing the acoustic recording from the funeral. The song drifted through the cool night air, and for a moment, it was as if Ace himself was still there, tuning his guitar, preparing to play one more show for the stars. In the end, Ace Frehley's story was never about perfection. It was about resilience, reinvention, and the undying power of music to connect hearts across distance and time. His passing reminded the world that behind every rock legend is a man who bleeds, dreams, and loves just like anyone else. Peter Criss's tribute wasn't just a performance. It was an act of brotherhood, forgiveness, and eternal respect. And that mysterious recording, whispered to a room full of mourners, became something sacred, a reminder that even when the stage lights fade, the echoes of a true artist never die. Because somewhere, in a quiet studio filled with old guitars and worn-out amplifiers, the soul of Space Ace still hums in the silence, waiting for the next note to begin.